What is life inside Russia today? Because I remember the day when the war started, people were fleeing the country. Companies were scrambling, trying to figure out what to do. Then you've got brands that started leaving the country as well. So there's a bit of chaos at the beginning. But somehow the country, from the outside at least, has continued humming along. What's your analysis of the economy?
Russia economically went into chaos, and Russians started buying US dollars, expecting Russian ruble to fall. The state stepped in and they started introducing this war economy laws, and that stabilized the economy. You can't change economy just like that overnight. It takes a long time for changes to take effect. It's been 3.5 years now. We are seeing the collapse right now. Vladimir Putin is not an elected president who can just step down and go and live in retirement. No, he's bet everything on his absolute power. He's the king of the hill. And there are plenty of people who want to become kings of that same hill as well.
I'm pretty excited for this conversation because I speak to a lot of military experts whenever I talk about the war. But you do a lot of coverage of what Russia is like, how it is living in Russia, expats that left the region, what their sentiment is like. You talk about how much influence and what Putin's grip is like today, especially post mutiny. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you to really understand what is happening inside Russia, because I always get two sides of the story. So maybe let me start of what is life inside Russia today? Because when I went to Moscow, and Kiev in the same 2-month period. It looked pretty normal in Moscow, and Kiev was different story. Uh, but it's very hard to see below the surface whether there's cracks in the economy or not. So I'd love to get your thoughts on what the situation is like in Russia.
In Russia, we say Moscow is not Russia. Moscow is Moscow. So if you want to see glamour, the glitz, the good life, you go to Moscow. To the center of Moscow, you'll see everything shines there. Okay, if you want to see how real Russia is, how real regular people, ordinary folks live, you get outside Moscow. And literally, you could drive, you could cross the city line, and you would find a completely different place. But obviously, if you go far from Moscow, you'll see how regular Russia is. So you got the impression of Moscow, not Russia. And that's a lot of people say that when they say, I visited Russia. How was it? Glamorous. Very clean, very safe, very nice, lots of rich people, lots of nice cars. That's Moscow. St. Petersburg also is something like Moscow, not as glamorous, but still very well off. The rest of Russia is different.
Interesting, because Moscow, it's as you described. It's like it's always Christmas Day. It's a beautiful, beautiful city. And when I went to Kiev, they're in war mode. They've got um, they've got a cutoff time where everyone has to go home. No one's allowed outside unless you got a permit, a curfew. You can't party. The sentiment is just very, very different. Any parties are underground. Um, but you say that outside of Moscow and to an extent St. Petersburg, life is very different in Russia. Can you describe that? And how did it change? Describe how it is, but also how it was pre the war and how it is today.
In the 90s, Russia was wild, wild, wild west, the land of opportunities, because the country was going through the process of transformation from the USSR, from communism to capitalism. So the transformation took about 10 years. It was very hard, but very interesting, very hopeful time, because things were getting better and better. Okay, so then from about 2000 to 2012, I call it the golden years of Russia. Living in Russia was fabulous. I lived in the USA for a while, and then I returned to Russia back in 2004. And it was, wow, gold rush. So much money, so many projects, so much partying, so many expats. Everyone was just making good money, having a good time. Then things changed after Vladimir Putin became the president for the third time in 2012, and the state started tightening the grip over the country, over the people. Okay, at first they started doing it slowly, and then I call it stepping stone strategy. Some call it boiling the frog. Then step by step by step, the government was first squeezing out the political opposition, then going after political opposition, then introducing new legislation that would give state more power. It was a very slow process, and it culminated in 2022, obviously, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and then everything changed back then. So, how Russians lived before war was fairly normal life. Was Moscow was fabulous, just the way that you saw it recently if you traveled to Moscow. Festivals every single week. Summers are fabulous. Weather not so great in the wintertime. Summertime great. Lots of opportunities, high-paying jobs, clean streets, nice cars. The whole 9 yards. Well, you witnessed it not too long ago. In Russia, life was still good. People lived their lives. They didn't bother the government much by protesting, by being politically active. And the government didn't bother them much. There was a social contract. The government, we provide you decent life, and you don't get into politics. That was the social contract between Russian society and the powers to be at the top. The Russian economy had been stagnant for about 10 years before the start of the war, but it was okay. People were still managing to live, to own cars, to buy apartments, houses, to lead nice lives. And then everything changed when the war started, obviously.
Can you break that down? Because I remember the day when the war started, people were fleeing the country. Companies were scrambling, trying to figure out what to do. Then you've got brands that started leaving the country as well. So there's a bit of chaos at the beginning. And then there was talks about the Russian economy just completely crumbling and becoming a pariah state. But somehow the country, from the outside at least, just continued humming along. The ruble recovered, and all the talk about the Russian economy crumbling, with China's support and to an extent other countries like Turkey and India, it seems to be doing better than most people expected. Now, how much better is hard to tell, especially certain, like for example, lack of technological improvements will start impacting productivity over many years and not instantly. A lot of the parts that Russia is replacing with cheaper parts from China, for example, Western parts to their machinery, their manufacturers, their factories, those cheaper parts will start to wear off in the next few years. And that's when you'll see, some analysts are saying, you'll start seeing the real damage. It's already been over 2 years. What's your analysis of the economy?
This topic is so huge. It's going to take us a while to discuss it. Now,
But
first of all,
I'd love to discuss it because it's so important. Sorry, Konstantin, it's so important. And no, everyone is just biased one way or another. Either the economy's dead and is about to crumble any day, or the economy's better than the US and Europe combined. It just depends on what the person's stance is. That's why I'd love to get your insight into it.
I am economist. I studied economy for 7 years and then some. I monitor Russian economy every single day since the start of the war. And everything I talk about, I project onto economic terms. Okay, because I believe that economy is the foundation of everything. Now, where do I start? When the war started, first of all, I think that the war was not supposed to be the war. It was not planned to last for a very long time. There were so many signs at the time when Putin attacked Ukraine. There were so many signs that it wasn't going to last a very long time. Just one example, Russian airports, 8 airports in southern and western part of Russia, close to Ukraine fairly, were shut down for 2 weeks initially. and I had some friends working at Rostov Airport, and the message inside was this: "Don't worry, just we close doors at the airport. That's not gonna last a long time. You're not going to be laid off. Just take a chill pill for a couple of weeks, and then you'll come back. We'll open doors, and then everything's gonna go back into normal." And that's how it felt at the time in the Russian society. And obviously, there are rumors that Russians were bringing two sets of uniforms: regular uniform and uniform for parade, and things like that. And Russian propaganda, they did not. Um, they they were selling this idea that Ukraine was not going to last for a very long time. 3 days in and out operation. Okay, so no one had prepared for the war, because you have to do a lot in terms of economy to switch country from to war economy from normal mode. Nothing had been done, and Russian officials, all of them, at high level, and I had some connections at the time at high level and at local provincial levels, they were shocked. No one knew what to do. No one knew what was going on. There was informational vacuum for 3 days. So the war started on the 24th of February, and I remember every single day. Now, very first day, I realized what a catastrophe Russia brought upon itself, because I could see the consequences, economic consequences, for years ahead. And basically, what I started doing is going live every single day and telling people in the world what was happening around me, what I saw in Russia. And there were things happening in terms of economy, but not really much. First things that started affecting Russians were chasm in Russian society. Russian society was split immediately on day 2. And the cancellations started between friends, because some supported what Putin was doing and some were against, saying, "What are you doing? You can't just attack your neighbor for no good reason." And at first week, you could speak up publicly, and a lot of Russians, a lot of prominent people, performers, athletes, they spoke up. And only a week after, Russian state started taking steps towards regulating informational space, started introducing new laws, such as you could get 7 years for basically what they say is spreading the fakes of the Russian army, like things like that. Because before it was, Russians were free to speak up against the government, criticize its actions, and so forth. Then I started seeing that Russia started changing about a week after, okay? And 2 weeks after, it became clear that in and out operation failed, miserably failed, and no one knew what was coming. And the Russian state completely shut up, the propaganda shut up, and they started coming up with what to say next, how to justify this war. First, there were 2 justifications made: denazification and demilitarization. That's it. In and out. To denazify Ukraine, whatever Nazis, I went to Ukraine many times. I didn't see any Nazis there, and then demilitarize Ukraine. Once we do that, in a few days, we're out. No, they failed to do that. They got stuck. They started retreating from Kyiv, if you remember, in the late March. And they started inventing things on the go. They started changing the country. But I want to emphasize this: there was no plan initially. And Russia, without plan, it kind of like descended into chaos. Now, economy, it doesn't really, you can't change economy just like that overnight. Okay, economies change. It takes a long time for changes to take effect. And that's exactly what we're seeing in Russia. Now, what was instant, as you said, a lot of Western companies started leaving. And it was such a shock to Russians, to politicians, to people. The first one was like IKEA. I remember clearly, March 1st. So Russia invades Ukraine on February 24th. March 1st, IKEA announces tomorrow, the following day, March 2nd, would be the last day IKEA in Russia. And everyone was like, that's not happening. Why? What have we done wrong? You know, what's going on? This is Ukraine, and you punishing us for Ukraine? And then I remember it was a huge shock, and IKEA simply closed doors 2 days after announcement. They sold everything out, and they left. Then the next one is Apple. Stopped selling everything Apple in Russia. The next one was McDonald's. I actually saw McDonald's closing doors. I had the last McDonald's meal, and I filmed it. That's out there on the internet. And other companies just got up and left, and there were hundreds of them. Russia economically went into chaos. Well, I wouldn't say it chaos, panic. It was panic, and Russians started buying US dollars, expecting Russian ruble to fall, to devalue, and it was devaluing a great deal. Well, the state stepped in, and they forbade to Russians to withdraw money from their bank accounts on, I believe, March 10th of 2022. If you had dollars on your bank account, you couldn't get cash. So they started introducing this war economy laws, and they introduced quite a few laws in the first weeks after the invasion, and that stabilized the economy. It did not lead to the collapse, complete collapse. And it's been 3.5 years now, and we are seeing the
Crazy.
collapse right now. Right now. Russia has lasted so long for two major reasons. First reason, it had accumulated so much funds in reserves. Half of it was frozen, has been frozen in Europe, $320 billion. But then another $300 billion were placed in Russia, in Russian banks. Okay, so Putin has been using this savings account to basically, patch up all the holes in Russian economy for 3 years. The second reason, that year, 2022, I don't know if you recall, but oil price went up through the roof. And Russia was still selling, like exporting fossil fuels freely, natural gas and oil, and it started raking in money. I believe it made, don't quote me on that, but around $200 billion, somewhere extra income because of extremely high oil prices.
Over what
So
period of
that
time?
added from February of 2022, because when Russia invaded, the prices, the markets, global markets reacted, prices went up. And the first action that the Europeans took against Russian oil and gas, against Russian oil, was on 6th of December of 2022. Basically, they put a ceiling, saying that price ceiling, that company, that no one could buy Russian oil at higher than $60 per barrel. So they basically cut the profits off for Russia. And then another blow was that Russia cut off its natural gas supply to Europe, its best customer. In August of 2022, Vladimir Putin decided to blackmail Europeans, saying, oh, you're going to have a very cold winter. You have to cooperate with us. You've been placing so many sanctions and bashing us and all of that, but we're going to cut off natural gas. And he did. He said due to maintenance of the pipeline, Nord Stream, and so Russia stopped on its own, stopped selling natural gas to Europe. And then a few days after, the pipelines were blown up. But they were blown up already, not functioning. Okay,
Who do you
so
think blew
it
them up
was...
physically?
Say it again?
Who do you think blew them up physically? Who blew up the pipeline?
There are rumors, investigations that Ukrainians are behind. They're rumors. I'm not an expert on that. I know that I think at least one Ukrainian is wanted in Europe.
Poland, I think.
Oh, yes.
If you
yes.
had to speculate though, like looking at, and I'm sure you've done this on privately, not talk about it publicly, but if you try to connect the dots, see who benefits the most, would you say Ukraine is most
Well,
likely to have done it? Just purely speculation. And who do you and would you think it would have been, if it was Ukraine, would it have included the go ahead from the West, from the US or Europe?
Mario, I don't know who did this, that blowing up the pipelines, but I know that there are two parties that benefit. Ukraine definitely benefits from Russia not selling oil to Europe because, well, obviously, Russia is waging the war on Ukraine, and Ukraine is trying to defend itself in any way possible. And the less money Russia gets from exporting its fossil fuels, the better for Ukraine. Easier for for defending the country. And then the United States of America is definitely the
Yes.
beneficiary of this move because
Can you explain that?
for
Can you please explain that for the audience, economically, why the US benefits?
for years, you see, Russia and Europe had a strategical partnership based on natural gas supply in Europe. Russia, the pipelines were built back in the 70s. A close cooperation between Germany and Soviet Union. Germany supplied pipes because Russia didn't have Soviet Union didn't have technology to build pipes. It was very outdated country, and the USSR paid for pipes with natural gas, and ever since the USSR and then Russia supplied natural gas into Europe. So Europe benefited from very cheap gas because it doesn't take much to actually, you build the infrastructure once and you just keep on extracting gas and sending it to Europe. So it was very cheap gas, much cheaper than liquefied natural gas. In the United States, Europe is the best customer for fossil fuels, always have been. And Russia dominated European market. So the United States of America also extracts a great deal of natural gas. Well, it doesn't have the pipeline going to Europe, but it has ports for liquefying natural gas. And the deal was Americans wanted to buy natural gas, wanted to export natural gas to Europe. And they couldn't compete with Russia because Russian gas was so much cheaper. And it was a huge economic business battle going on for a couple decades. Americans always made this argument that Russia used natural gas as geopolitical weapon. And Russia always said, well, you know what? That's just business. Americans turned out to be right. Russia did use natural gas as the geopolitical weapon. Russia wanted to freeze Europeans to death. Back in 2022, that's what it did. It shut off natural gas, saying, well, you know what? You're out of luck. And they started putting advertisements on Russian TV how Europe would freeze the following winter because of
Interesting.
harsh winter.
So you've
yes,
essentially got both countries, Russia using natural gas as leverage, and obviously the US using the US dollar as leverage against Russia. So you've just got, it just shows the amount of overlap between economics and politics.
Huge, yes. But the thing is, Russia, by making that decision to shut off natural gas supply, simply shot itself in the head, not in the foot, because it gave European market to the Americans, saying, please take it. We're not going to supply the natural gas any longer. And Americans, the Norwegians stepped in, I think the Qataris, and right now there are different countries that are trying to use Nabucco pipeline through Turkey and so forth. And Russia just killed itself economically, committed complete suicide,
By blocking
So,
natural gas exports to Europe before the blow up of the Nord Stream pipeline.
yes, of course. Russia obviously it's Vladimir Putin made the decision to stop selling its natural gas to Europe. Its best, greatly paying customer, the best customer you can ever imagine. It's right there. It's right next to Russia. It's, few kilometers, from Russia and non-existing pipelines. Russia didn't have to do anything. It was just sitting there and raking in money. That's how it worked. Fossil fuels for Russia were the bread makers. And I knew that very well. I had monitored the situation before. I was actually in the gas business, and I constructed power plants for 20 years before the war, and constructed a lot of gas-fired power plants, coal-fired. So I knew the insides of the industry. Okay, so I had Gazprom as my customer at one point, and it was my business, Um,
So
oh,
how with
uh,
with shooting themselves in the head with the blocking of natural gas imports? I know they had the piggy bank and had oil prices spike, but was that so? You said that's what allowed them to survive, and some would even say thrive in those 2.5 years, and still do well economically for the ruble to recover. But you're saying that now it's starting to unwind. Can you explain why now, and where do you see those indicators that are starting to unravel?
all over. Let me just take a step backwards and step back and tell you that Russia did not shoot itself in the head only by shutting off natural gas supply to Europe. Russia shot itself by invading Ukraine because at that point it became crystal clear that Russia stepped over the red line, that it became the pariah, it became the aggressor. And whatever the reasons were, whatever the reasons Russia was giving, obviously it wouldn't be tolerated well by the international community. And the results immediately followed the sanctions. There was a vote in the United Nations, and I think 180 or something, 85 countries voted against Russian aggression. So that's, they didn't vote under pressure from America, from Europe. No, it's just a natural reaction to Russia's aggression. And it was obvious that things would just turn sour more and more for Russia. At least to me, as economist, I saw that. So it's been a bumpy ride, but generally the trend downwards has been seen all along. Okay, Russia started. It's very simple. Economy is very simple. Okay, treat Russian economy as household economy. That you have income, you have expenditures, right? You earn,
And
you
savings.
spend. And well, whatever you earn, whatever you don't spend, you save, you invest. The country acts the same way, right? So Russia was in very good economic shape. It was earning more than it was spending for years, for 2 decades. And whatever it had left over, it had invested. I call it the savings account. The technical name is National Welfare Fund. So Russia had lots of money because fossil fuels and mineral resources, that's what Russia is known for. It was just exporting so much. And in 2022, it started spending way more instantly. The war economy, the military industrial caucus started sucking money in. And then it started earning less because of the sanctions, because of so many things. I call economic tsunami happened to Russia. Well, you can call it perfect storm. People started leaving. Millions and millions of Russians, just like myself, left. The cream of the crop, the professionals, high earners, business owners who created jobs, who paid taxes,
Big
over
brain
3
drain.
million have left. Incredible brain drain. Number two, Russia was cut off the access to the international financial markets. It couldn't get access to cheap, long money. Number three, it lost the bread makers of natural oil and gas. It still sells some oil, but there have been sanctions placed upon it, and the pressure has been increasing. So Russia makes less and less. Obviously, it still sells oil, and then it still sells other things such as metals, but the quantities are just incomparable to what it was selling before the war. Perfect storm, really. The states started increasing taxes. The fiscal tools have been put in place. Russian businesses started disposable incomes started shrinking, and its process has been happening over 3 years, I would say. Now, we are at the point where that savings account that Putin tapped into to patch up economic holes has been dried up. There's no money left. There is a
How much do you
huge
think?
budget
How much do you think
deficit.
How much do you think there's left?
Nothing. There are 2,300 tons of gold left, but it's not liquid asset anymore because gold right now, Russian gold is under sanctions. No country can buy large quantities. Russia can sell here and there, but then first of all, they sell at discount, just like oil, they sell at huge discount now. And then gold, they are selling just a bit of it, And then they have some, I think,
Can't they sell it to China? China's gobbling up gold
no,
like crazy in the last couple of years. They can't sell it to China.
well, they have not sold it to China, and it can't even cover up the budget deficit of this year and next year, even if they sold it to China. But they're not, and they have some funds in yuan, the Chinese currency, not much, around trillion rubles or so. So a few, $15 billion left, something like that. And that's the very last resort emergency fund right now. So basically, Russia is spending so much more than it's earning right now. And the budget deficit right now is, in the beginning of the year, it was planned for this year 1.17 trillion rubles. It's 6 times higher. So around 7 or 8, we will know the exact number at the end of the year. So there's economic catastrophe
But
happening.
how's the GDP? How the GDP numbers still looking good? Unemployment is still low. Wages are still growing. Inflation's
No, they're
even
not.
dropping recently as well.
Where'd you get your info from?
This is where it's tricky because it's just difficult, and same for China when I try to analyze the economy. It's just difficult to know what numbers to trust, like including when I talk about the death toll on the front line. One side tells me Russians are dying in the thousands a week, another one's like they're dying 10 a day. That extreme. It's just hard to get the actual numbers. But you're saying that GDP is not as they say it is, or unemployment is not as low as they say it is?
Now, let's break it down, step by step. Let's talk about GDP. Russian GDP grew over 3 years. Each year it grew. This year the growth is expected to be 0.5%, close to zero. So this is it. No growth anymore. Well, imagine this. Russian economy is split into 2 parts right now. First part is the war economy. The military-industrial complex enterprises have been booming for the past 3.5 years. There's so much money. All that savings account basically was spent on the military-industrial complex. Tanks, missiles, the nukes, planes, whatever they make, That doesn't add value to Russian economy because whatever they create, the products they create, they send to kill Ukrainians. So it's not, it's pure spending. Okay, so there's no multiplier effect on the economy. With that, Russian economy grew, let's say, by 3.6%. Imagine, the war economy, some experts say grew by 30%. Imagine how the second part of the economy, the civil economy, had to fall down so much. So the overall growth would be, let's say, 3.6%. And that's where the balance kicks in. One part grew incredibly, that's true. And another part, it declined also incredibly. And right now, even with this incredible growth of the war economy, the overall growth is still zero. And this is absolutely true information. Some enterprises of military-industrial complex have stopped growing and they started laying people off. That's military-industrial complex I'm talking about. Uralvagonzavod is Russia's largest, most important military enterprise that manufactures tanks. Announced that it was switching people to a 4-day week, so this is it. The party's over, basically. That's GDP. If you want to take other indicators, macroeconomic indicators, we can do that.
Just one question though: if the party's over, and then if you add the recent sanctions, U.S. sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, which is probably one of the most aggressive things Trump has done so far against Russia, and the Indian decision to cut Russian oil imports by 50%. Why is Putin not accepting some sort of peace deal and continuing the war? So one argument is that his incentives to continue the war, and obviously there's various points there. One argument is that he's dependent on the war economy, and as soon as that war economy stops, he's in trouble. His grip on power, will slide because a lot of people are dependent on it. Another argument is like, no, his grip on power is fine. The economy will continue doing fine. We'll pivot back to a normal economy after the war ended, like we saw in the US after World War II. But Putin's continuing the war because he has the upper hand. What we're seeing with in the Donbass right now, and he is sticking his guns to his initial demands for the last 2 years, and this is why he's not stopping the war. He has the upper hand. Why would he? What would be your analysis of why Trump is not accepting to end the war on different terms to what he wanted a year ago?
Huge question. Okay, let's try to break it down into different parts. First of all, just the general idea of what is happening to Russian economy. The Titanic hits the iceberg. It's big boom. Everyone hears, everyone feels, the vessel shaking. Everyone gets out. What do they see? Not much. The light is, electricity is on, music is playing. Yes, there's iceberg. It's right next to the Titanic. But Titanic keeps on going forward. So everyone sees that, yeah, something happened. It's no big deal. To go back to our whatever we were doing before. And people go back to their rooms. People go back to a restaurant. They continue eating steak dinners. And the music continues playing. But you know what? The damage done. And the water, the Titanic starts taking in water. And its disaster, it's predetermined. It's already happened. It's just everyone will have to wait for 2 hours for it to go down. This is exactly what happened to Russia. And you will see, we don't have to wait for long. You will see Russia going under completely within a year. It's going under right now. Russia, when first missiles flew to Ukraine, that's when Russia hit its iceberg. Okay, and it's been taking water. In Russia's case, it's been spending all it had reserved. Okay, and then this is it. We are at the point in the fall and in winter of 2024, 2025, and in winter 2026, at the point when the lights are out, okay, or they flickering. Whoever was underneath the water line, rushing upstairs because the water's flooded everywhere. The music has stopped playing. People start realizing that something's not right on this ship, okay, and it starts tilting fast. That's where we at this point right now.
When you say the music stops and people worry, is that the war ending or the economy cracking?
No.
When
The war will not end. I'm talking about the economy. The war, the music has stopped. Well, no, let me give you some real life examples, right? In Moscow, everything's fine. Great transportation, public transportation system. You probably enjoyed it. Moscow subway, Moscow buses, clean, brand new. They introduced this new technology. Then some buses, they replace glass windows with TV screens and they broadcast live whatever's outside. So instead of looking in the window, you're looking at the TV and, that's great. Well, in Russian cities, they're canceling bus routes. People start walking. They can't afford buses any longer. Okay? Because, first of all, the buses are old. There is no money inside provincial budgets to replace buses. No money to fix them. No money to pay more to bus drivers. A lot of bus drivers were mobilized and taken to Ukraine. A lot of them already killed. And in multiple cities in Russia, people do not have access to public transportation. I'm not saying everywhere, but this is starting. Now, last week, 25 Russian cities were without electricity. That is what I'm calling the party is over. Rolling blackouts. They don't say that on the news. You know how I found? Someone from my city told me that all of a sudden they were introduced to a schedule, like they would shut down electricity for a few hours every so often. Now, I lived through it in the USSR. We had that in the late 80s. Every day we would not get supply of electricity, and we had to live around it. And I was really surprised, and I started looking at this, digging deeper, and I found that 20 last week it was 20, I think it was 26 cities, large and small, had the very same problem, rolling blackouts. And the
Because of Ukraine's
only
targeting of
way,
the but why is
no,
the blackouts there? Because of Ukraine's targeting of the energy infrastructure or the economy?
no. It's I'll just I'll tell
Please,
you
yeah.
in details. It's my business. I know the power plants well. Um, the only way you can find this information, if you go to Telegram channels and groups of the local communities inside those cities and perhaps districts of the cities. Russia used to run on Telegram channels and the WhatsApp groups. You know that. And if you go and start reading those messages, then the local authorities usually post the schedule of when electricity would get shut down. If you go online, you will be able to find it. But Russian propaganda, Russian media acting as if it's not happening. Well, it is happening. I'm sorry. Why it's happening? Russia, when it opened up to the global markets, one of the first companies moved in were large heavy machinery manufacturers, such as General Electric, Siemens, Mitsubishi, and so forth. And then they started selling their equipment in Russia, and which was way advanced, more advanced than Soviet made. Gas turbines, steam turbines, Siemens, General Electric were fighting, well, competing against each other. We used to work with Siemens, although I built a turbine manufacturing plant for General Electric back in Russia. The company that I was an executive at, this was the chief designer of the plant in Rybinsk, okay, back in 2012. And historically, we've been close to Siemens, and we used to build power plants for a general contractor, and we used Siemens turbines. Fantastic turbines. They last a long time, they very efficient, and they're much cheaper than old Soviet turbines because they're more compact, they're less heavy. Well, Siemens left, and they stopped supplying service. They stopped supplying spare parts. The turbines have a term of use, and it's usually decades, but you have to do maintenance tests, maintenance services. You have to use special tools, you have to use special parts, and you have to use Siemens engineers that come from the factories that are stationed in they used to be stationed in Russia, and basically Siemens used to take care of its own turbines. Well, Siemens left. And although some service is provided by whatever is left, it's local Russian company now, they don't do it in the volume like it's needed, like not
And China
100%.
China couldn't fill that void?
No, how can you, let's say, provide spare parts for Siemens turbines? It's a very highly
Mm,
technological
very
equipment. That's
specific.
know-how,
Mm.
very specific. Yeah, each part is numbered, and when they produce at the Siemens plant, they know where it's going to. Just like that
So what you're s
turbine that went to Crimea.
so what you're saying is that a lot of the things that happened right after the war, including companies leaving and obviously sanctions on the country, take time to take effect. And we're starting to see those effects now, like the blackouts you're referencing.
Absolutely.
But then if that's the
Absolutely. You just
case,
nailed it.
if that's the case, Konstantin, back to the other question is why isn't Putin accepting a deal on different terms instead of sticking to the 4 oblasts? Why doesn't he accept freezing the lines as they are before the economy cracks and it threatens his grip on
It has
power?
cracked already. It has cracked already. We're seeing the military escalation right now from Putin. Exactly because of that. Because all economy has cracked. He knows that well. And there is unrest growing in Russia. There are protests, sparks, small ones. But you know what? It always starts with sparks. Big fires. First you get sparks and a little bit of smoke. So this is what I'm talking about tonight, actually. After I'm done here, I'm doing a live stream on the protesting starting,
Interesting.
picking up in Russia.
When did it
Then
start?
it started, I was given an interview in August, and I was asked the very same question about protests. And I said, no protests. There hasn't been any protests since I was at the last protest in March of 2022 in Moscow personally. It was a very scary experience. But since then, there were no protests. And they started in provinces of Russia. They started economic protests, political protests, and civil protests against blockage of internet. Okay, but we have seen political protests now. Just recent developments, couple last weeks. A music band was arrested in St. Petersburg because they were simply playing music of those performers who are banned in Russia now, who have fled Russia. So they're arrested and they're being sentenced right now. And that movement of protesting in support of those performers is picking up as we speak right now. Okay, so protesting is happening. Economic demise is happening. People simply seeing the prices going up like crazy. Like I'll just give you an example. A kilo of beef at a Russian store cost 700 rubles back in July. Right now, 990 rubles. Okay, it's
Inflation is pretty
25%.
crazy in Russia now.
It's crazy. Okay, people still definitely feeling the pinch. Infrastructure, the communal services start having problems. I'm not saying they're like falling apart completely. No, it takes time. But you know what? Those men who are supposed to take care of them are fighting in Ukraine because the communal services were the first places they started mobilizing men, less educated, who didn't make much money. They mobilized them, threw them to Ukraine. Who's taking care of things? Not too many folks now. So, and sooner or later, wear and tear is driving everything into oblivion. Now, what else?
But what I still don't understand, sorry, Konstantin, what I still don't understand is, Trump wants to end this war. He wants the peace prize. He wants to get credit for it. And he put out a post, I think it was today or yesterday, saying, look, I've tried. It was harder than I thought. Ukraine and Russia, I'm paraphrasing, but Ukraine and Russia have to really continue the war themselves. Just kind of moving away from his efforts to end the war, not giving up, but kind of washing his hands in case he fails. What I'm struggling to understand, though, is if Russia's economy is struggling, and if there's sparks of protest, which is what Putin is worried about the most, especially after the mutiny 2 years ago, is something he's more sensitive to. If that's the case, a rational person, a rational, smart leader, any leader would just start looking for an end to the war. It's been 3 years. He's already got a lot of territory. No need to keep, you've got the majority of these 4 oblasts, all of, almost all of Luhansk. Why wouldn't he freeze the lines and end the war if the economy is actually struggling?
Not only economy struggling, not only street protests growing, he's very afraid of his own circle. There's chatter right now happening inside the power groups of Russia, and I think he's much more afraid of that than anything else. Well, what you are
Is that
saying?
sorry, the chatter is people. Sorry, just one question. The chatter is people that want the war to continue. They're
They leads.
hawks. Is that
No, they leads. They leads. They
okay?
don't. They're not satisfied. They're very angry how things have been going. They don't see any end of this. So the chatter is right now. No one is saying it openly, but the chatter is this anger, and then sooner or later, people will start thinking, "What if we take matters into our own hands and change things?"
Mm.
Okay, and I think that's the biggest threat for Vladimir Putin right now. It's growing. Okay, it's nothing catastrophic right now, and I think we're going to be seeing a lot of oppressions against not just regular folks on the streets, but look for sudden deaths, for people flying out the windows, high ranks, or firings of KGB generals and so forth. But anyway, answering your question, you are thinking like a normal person. To you, if everything is going to hell, then you gotta stop the war and try to rebound the economy somehow and trying to get back to normal, right?
Mhm.
That's where
Correct.
everyone is getting wrong. Because Putin cannot stop the war. He will not stop the war. Stopping the war is his sudden death, instant death. Okay, he's gonna be
Why?
out of the office, and it means, uh, what do you mean why? He's the dictator. He's not. He's not. You know, he just caught me off guard by this question. There will be so many questions to Putin. People will come back from the front line. There are more than a million Russians there. Okay, and they will be asking very serious questions to the authorities and to Putin. Putin's friends, who are going to lose a great deal, also going to be asking questions. The army generals, the KGB generals, all the Siloviki, they will be asking questions because their lives are becoming much, much worse right now. Okay, the pie for them is also shrinking, and they started fighting each other. Okay, Vladimir Putin
So
is not a elected president who can just in a couple years step down and go and live in retirement. No, he's bet everything on his absolute power. He controls the shots. He's the king of the hill, and there are plenty of people who want to become kings of hills of that same hill as well.
when
I
he
think
when he gets
it's
those asked
pretty
those
obvious.
questions, when he asks those questions, wouldn't he be able? His answer is like, if people ask him why did we do all this? Well, his answer, the way he could explain it is like, Ukraine will no longer join NATO, assuming this is part of the peace deal. Russia was able to annex these territories that are full of minerals. Economically, it's a great decision. Ukraine's been demilitarized, denazified, whatever story he wants to tell, but it's mainly NATO's expansion and drawing the line at Ukraine. Isn't that enough of an explanation, especially considering that in many people's eyes, including people in Russia, they see Russia as having, Russia has annexed territory. They've got more than just the Crimea. They've got all these other oblasts as well. Wouldn't that be a win for Putin when he goes back home and ends the war? He's not
That's
coming
a
in.
crushing
He's not coming
defeat.
empty-handed.
That's crushing defeat. Right now, like 2 days ago, the Speaker of Russian Parliament officially announced that Russia is changing, the state is changing legislation that obliges doctors to work now. Because 8 out of 10 doctors in Russian medical clinics and hospitals are missing. Okay? So when people come back home and they will not receive any medical treatment, they will not receive any support from the state, they won't be able to find any jobs, and obviously they will bring guns with them. There will be a huge wave of crime. Now, when pensioners will not be receiving their pension on time, when regular folks will be getting laid off and won't be able to afford food and support their families, I think that all will be asking questions. And the biggest question is, why did we need exactly those territories? Because that's burnt land. There are no mineral resources there that are economically viable to extract. If they were, Ukrainians would be extracting them themselves. How come they weren't before Russia invaded? It was never about land. It was never about resources. To me, that's insanity. It was never about NATO. Oh my gosh, it's what NATO? Russia, as a result of invading Ukraine, received 2 new NATO members. One of them is what, couple hundred miles away from St. Petersburg. How safe is
Unintentionally, I
that?
think. But what would say is
Well, you can't do that. If you are in geopolitics, you're playing the game of geopolitical chess. That's very intentionally. If you make a move, then you get a reaction on every single action. And that's what the think tanks are for. And this is where the war rooms are, and people get together and think a few steps ahead. Okay. So how is this unintentional? I
But
think
if
that was
but if you
very
ask,
obvious.
but look at what Trump. So whenever someone says this, and I was talking to the Ukrainian ambassador to the US just 2 weeks ago, and what I said to her is, obviously, I draw the line at Putin invading Ukraine. There's red lines you just don't cross, certain rules you don't break, and there shouldn't be any exceptions. He is the aggressor, but I don't put the blame solely on him. I think look at what Trump is doing in Latin America. Chinese influence in Panama, he's all up in arms. Venezuela moving closer to China. Now people are talking about potential strikes on Venezuela. And Brazil started sanctioning the leaders there for various political reasons and now trying to improve the relationship. So he moves them away from China. We saw what happens in Cuba back in the Cold War. So if, for example, China and Chinese allies are putting missiles in Canada, you've heard the argument. It's a very logical argument. I'm sure Trump or any leader, whoever's the president of the US, would not sit idly while this is happening. Can't the same argument be made for Russia for their own safety? If NATO's expanding and putting their biggest base in Romania, Ukraine is talking about joining NATO, and NATO's expanded eastwards over many, many years. For me, if I look at this as I can try and look at it objectively, it doesn't justify the war, but I would say it's at least partly to blame for invading Ukraine.
Mario,
And
your argument with Mexico.
taking into consideration that the war was not meant to last this long. It was meant to be a quick war. Putin draws the line. Ukraine is a red line. You don't go into Ukraine. Policymakers have been saying this for a long time. They've been warning the U.S. administration over the years. Ukraine is a red line. Russia's made it clear. Ukraine's a red line. The goal was Putin was to invade Ukraine for a few days, draw the line, change the government, and that was it. And obviously, he was stuck in the war. It was a bad mistake, and we are where we are. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Your argument doesn't stand about Mexico. If China would place, we've seen that happen before. The Caribbean crisis in the late 60s. Exactly the very same thing what you're describing happened. Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. And the stinky substance hit the fan. And you know how the USA resolved the whole thing? Diplomatically. And that's what Russia should have done, diplomatically. If obviously there were threats to Russia, or at least Putin thought they were threats. NATO could not expand, period, because NATO cannot take any members with territorial disputes, current territorial disputes. So NATO was out of question whatsoever. It's not the reason. Moreover, NATO argument was made up later. I document everything, okay? About 6 weeks into the invasion, first they come with the NATO excuse. First, it was plain and simple. Russia invaded Ukraine for two things. Number one, to denazify. Number two, to demilitarize.
I think
that's what Putin
I think we agree.
said.
I know, but I think we agree that the denazification. I agree with you. That doesn't make sense. But like, if you go to the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was resolved diplomatically, where the US had to remove missiles from Turkey and the Soviet Union from Cuba. That was the end goal. But we were close to a war in the region, and one would argue that Putin did try to solve the matter diplomatically, but NATO continued expanded eastwards over many, many years. There's been discussions about the whole argument in Germany about not 1 inch eastwards. That was the promise that Putin was made. And then that promise was constantly broken by different leaders.
Disagree with that. Now, back in 1997, that's when the real big expansion of NATO happened. I think there was the Baltic states, Poland, the Eastern European bloc countries that joined NATO. Okay, if Russia had problems with NATO back then, it would throw a fit back in 1997. And you know what Russia said about that? Nothing. It was okay. It was not a threat. because Russia back then admitted that all countries from the former Eastern European bloc were independent and sovereign, and they could make any decisions what they want. Now, Russia showed some dissatisfaction, and NATO made a compromise with Russia. It established, I think it was like a Russia-NATO committee, and Russia got a seat on the NATO board as, as a permanent representative. And Russians were happy. I remember 1997, not a single problem. Now, if NATO expansion would be a threat to Russia, back then it would become the threat. Okay, so I think this argument doesn't stand. That's number one. Number two, when Russia invaded Ukraine, NATO was not in the picture. No one said anything about NATO. And then for some weeks, Russian states started finding the excuse for the war. When they realized that in and out operation failed, they started finding an excuse how to justify, NATO, of course. And then, right then, they received two countries who joined NATO, Sweden and Finland. And another thing that proves my argument is that when Finland decided to join NATO and applied, then Vladimir Putin talked to the Finnish, I think he's a president or vice president, I think he was president. And right after, there was a statement made, it's still out there, you can fact check it. There was a statement made by Putin and by Russian propaganda that Finland joined NATO, and NATO becoming the neighbor of Russia from the north, from the northwest, and right next to St. Petersburg, was not going to be the threat of Russia. And then that renders all NATO claims, in my eyes, absolutely useless. Okay.
Yeah. So the argument of is Russia not complaining in 1997 for NATO's expansion, that's true. But I think there's also, when Putin became president, he wanted to be part of NATO. Had a discussion with Clinton.
Yes.
Was rejected.
3 years.
Reports.
For 3 years. You're absolutely correct.
So I think NATO was not seen as much of a threat back then than it would have been today, when he's been rejected a few times, or at least a couple of times reportedly, from joining NATO. Then later on, it became a threat as NATO continued expanding. I obviously I don't know.
NATO was not expanding. NATO was not expanding. You said continue. It expanded in 97, and that was it.
But there were talks about Ukraine joining NATO.
Georgia and Ukraine. But neither Georgia nor Ukraine would not be accepted to NATO, because both countries have had territorial disputes. Abkhazia, North Ossetia.
What would you say? Last question I have is, what would you say is the reason that Putin invaded Ukraine? What was the goal of that special military operation?
First of all, I'd like to take you, you brought up a very good topic. You said before NATO was not a threat, and it became the threat. Well, in reality, it did not become the threat of Russia. The portraying of NATO inside Russia changed. And there was a very good reason for that. Vladimir Putin served 2 terms as president, and then Dmitry Medvedev became the president. And Vladimir Putin went on to campaign for the third term, which was like, why would you do that? And Russians didn't understand that, a lot of them. He needed a very good reason. Back then, and I clearly remember, back then, for the first time in history, NATO all of a sudden turned from a friend to, America from, he didn't say enemies. He used to say sarcastically partners. I remember that clearly. During the debates, speaking to the public, he said, now we're seeing that they're beefing up against us, and it's us versus them. He simply used that excuse to create the enemy around Russia, to consolidate people behind him, to win elections, and to establish himself as, another president of Russia for the third term. They started pumping that idea that there are more and more enemies, and they really want to take Russia down. You see, for 20 years before, no one wanted to take Russia down. They were partners, trading partners, just cultural partners, And all of a sudden, in 2012, they became enemies. Now, next question: why Putin invaded Ukraine? His ratings started falling. He never had this. I believe. Okay, my speculations, of course. Okay, that's what I'm gonna say is my opinion. He never wanted to have the war with Ukraine. He wanted to do a quick to execute quick in and out operation to replace Ukrainian government, to install puppet president Yanukovych, perhaps. His ratings were falling at the time. The Russian economy had been stagnant. For 10 years, it grew at 1%. Okay. Things were okay, but he was losing popularity and the ratings were going down. Now, in 2014, he annexed Crimea, and it was bloodless in and out operation, in operation, and his ratings soared. My bet, he wanted to do the very same thing. He wanted complete control over Ukraine, but no war, of course. And I think he was grossly misinformed by his servants, by the secret police, whoever was in charge of preparing that operation. Okay. He thought he had the army number 2 in the world, the second strongest army. He thought that Ukrainians were sick of their government. He thought Ukrainians loved Russia. And as soon as Russians would move in, they would be greeted in Ukraine. And Ukrainian people would help to kick out their own government, to replace it with, another government. Okay, so Putin wanted the complete control of Ukraine, but no blood. That's what I think. And then once he made that decision, the stinky substance hit the fan.
We should definitely do another sit down, hopefully soon, because that's another hour having a discussion about the core issues that led to the war, and the early days of the war, discussing it a bit more, and where we are today. I think it's a really fascinating conversation, getting your take, being inside Russia, and your experience in the early days of the invasion, and your thoughts on the economy now. It's a very polarizing topic, and I'm sure, obviously, now we're going through the fog of war, but like as I said earlier, I speak to some people, and the casualty figures, the economic figures about Ukraine, about Russia, change depending who you're talking to. But we'll obviously get more clarity later on. But it was
Mario, may I interrupt
really,
you for a second?
please.
Look, what you're saying is very interesting. What I really would like to do is to sit down with another expert and argue, maybe 3 of us, and I can present the data. I can back up my words with the data.
I'd
Okay.
love that.
And I really would like other people to back their words with data, because
I'd love
obviously
that.
I am on the same page with you. I know what exactly where you're coming from. There are experts who say otherwise. Okay.
Exactly.
And I
This
am
is
so
my way.
sure in my words. I want to sit down and actually take the data out in front of me and prove it on data.
I would love to do that, and I appreciate you for offering it, because I'll say this to listeners: a lot of guests, now obviously I will never name them, but a lot of guests don't want to debate, and that's always a red flag. We ask them, "Hey, would you like to do a debate on this topic?" Like, no. But when there's one-on-one interview, they love it. So I'm going to take you up on that offer, and I enjoy doing debates because it allows me to try to at least get a bit more clarity on different different arguments that are being made. So I'm going to take you up on the offer, Konstantin. Thank you for mentioning it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, sir.